Hello, everybody. It's Joel Clark, publisher of Lone Wolfist, amongst many other wonderful games, but mostly Lone Wolfist. Anyway, hello. How's it going? As you can see, we have finally reclaimed the space in here a little bit. They had to tear the ceiling out and fix the leak that was in here, and then tear the floors out, so there's no carpet now. I'm just standing on the tile. But it's not wet. It's not a health hazard anymore, and so we now have our writing space back to write, which is nice. Hence a video, and this is maybe not the most flattering of videos, but a video nonetheless. All right, so what are we working on? So we're working on Acid and Steel. It is a bit of a time and effort commitment to make Acid and Steel happen. One of the most complicated things that I have done for this game, and the thing most time consuming, is designing techniques and designing lores, and that's pretty much everything in this product. It's techniques and lores. It's nice not having to break any truly new rules ground. For the most part, I'm just referencing systems that are in the core book. That's really nice. It does mean that any flaws in those systems that weren't threshed out whenever I put them in the core book are now becoming more apparent. And so it's like, well, I kind of wish I had a little more time and more playtesting to let these cook a little more before I published. Which, I mean, I guess that's the compromise for getting it out within at least a somewhat reasonable time frame of a few years. Oh, wonderful. It's time to do something. What is it? Oh, it's time to get the kids. It's actually not. This is my week without them. I get to have them next week, which is going to be very nice. But yes, the wonders of being a dad. So what I'm working on right now is I'm finishing up Yama. I just got all of his master level techniques written, and I'm working on the supreme level techniques today, and I would like to get him done by the end of the day. That's like the writing project I put out for myself. I'm going to take a break and get some Kung Pao chicken. I spent most of the day cleaning, so the place is nice again. I mean, it's definitely been better, but until actual repair crews get in here and start fixing things, it's going to be this. This is livable, however. I'd like to point out that even though this looks bad, it is dry. It was wet before. Wet is not livable. Dry is livable, especially with the cold of Alaska. So yes, I've got natural lighting right now. There's a lot of really nice light and fresh air that's coming through that window. It's a nice big window here on the lower floor. And for the most part, this room is pretty livable. I did a nice sweep in here today, so the floor looks okay. And the ceiling, for being as bare as it is, doesn't look dirty. It just looks a little, stripped. So fine place psychologically to sit down and tickety-tack at my keyboard, or in my case, with my standing desk, I'll probably stand up and do it. But yeah, we're doing a new Yama today. That is 2/7 of all of the Ashura that need to get done. I'm kind of interested in Yama. He's been a lot less kung fu than I thought he was going to be. One of the benefits of starting with a more martial focused Ashura, as I did with Ravana, was that he had a lot of kung fu punch moves that kind of came to me whenever I was writing him. But Yama's been a very interesting contrast with that. Yama is a bureaucratic death god. So a lot of his stuff is more mystical or more legal, and a lot less about punches and kicks. And so there's a lot of technique space in his style that is just about realizing his magical and bureaucratic potential. So that's really fascinating. It's strange to make a power set like that in a game that's as martial arts focused as mine is, because I was really feeling like there was big gulfs where you just weren't really able to manifest any kind of offense or defense power, and that felt weird for a really powerful monstrous being like him. But a lot of what you do, a lot of the offensive power comes from just being able to summon minions to do your dirty work for you. There's a lot of powers that do that. A lot of your powers allow you to evade things. There's a real defensive kind of dimension to it, where it's all about becoming ghostly or becoming intangible or vanishing or otherwise getting away from danger and damage. And most of the offense, such as it is more like being a secret artist. It's more like if you were a defensive build martially, but all of your stuff gave you big boosts to something like heart, and you were a social character who had the art of the courtier, and so your big thing was just tagging your opponents with really nasty social imbalances, or emotional imbalances rather. It's kind of like that. Yama's about getting you entangled in his bureaucracy and therefore having a lot of authority over you. And that's his big offensive push, is basically cursing you with this magical government that he's the figurehead of. Or I guess he's not really a figurehead, he really is, like, in charge of it. Um, so, um, so that wound up being a fascinating revelation. There's still a pretty good amount of summon a death scythe and sheave through people within it, but most of what you do offensively is you summon minions, you create the undead or conscript them and have them go fight your enemies. You get away from danger and you curse your enemies very narrowly and legally with these weird entanglements. And so his fighting style is way I didn't it's so weird not to know what something's going to be until you're done writing it. I can't emphasize enough how little I could have predicted Yama. But just kind of trying to force myself to have some congruence and patterns between his moves, and thinking of, like, okay, what's the ultimate things I want him to be able to do that he has to do if he's Yama? What are really good early representations of that? And then just lightly spackling in, okay, what, like, the overlay that links all of that together is, like, the strategy of a style. Every style, when you go to design it, has to have an internally cohesive tactical strategy that a player can approach and say, okay, this is how I fight. You know, for example, for Path of the Bullet, it's about kiting. It's about getting away from the enemy and shooting them. Like, that's how you fight. If you want to boil it down to the very basics of the style, you get away from the enemy so you have room to shoot them with your bullets. That's it. That's Path of the Bullet. Meanwhile, if you contrast that with Atomic Dragon Fist, you're supposed to get up in the enemy's face and overwhelm them with a weak but damaging offense and set everything on fire. That's how you fight with Atomic Dragon Fist. Lots and lots of fire, lots of chaos. You know, getting the most out of every single one of your effort dice and tilting them as much towards offense and disrupting the enemy as possible. It's my equivalent of the Red Sly deck, but as a martial art. You know, and so that's the strategy of that. And every style has a strategic unity to it, but it also needs to have a thematic unity. You have to be able to say, okay, like, what is the philosophy of this style? What is the history of this style? What's the fluff of the style? Why is it cool to do this? You know, and you could say, like, looking at Heaven and Earth Romance, which is the sword style for the Golden Lions. It's the only sword style, specifically sword style, in the game, right? But it's more than that. It also has, like, elements of, like, Piccolo style from Dragon Ball Z, and it also has a lot of, like, light and electricity and, like, holy powers and defensive powers. So the actual strategy with it is to set up a strong defense and then take your opportunity to use your sword and your balanced weapon for the biggest offensive advantage you can get in really targeted strikes. And most of the ancillary moves, like throwing electricity and what have you, they really are just there to kind of get any kind of, like, mobs of creatures of darkness off your back, or to give your opponent very little in the way of what is the word? It's not opportunity. Is it opportunity? Is that the word I'm looking for? But very little in the way of good options when it comes to facing you. If they decide to stay at range against you, then you can zap them, right? But if they decide to close, they're dealing with a really high defense, and then you get to slice them up with your sword. So, like, that's the strategy of it, but the theme of it, the thing that makes it really cool, is that you're like a holy golden paladin. You have all these, like, heaven-sent powers, and you can banish evil and do all this really cool I'm a badass good guy stuff. So, like, that's, like, the emotional appeal of the style. And it's a balancing act with things, right? Because you have to have things that fill out the spaces, and that you want every technique to have a reason to exist. It's kind of like designing, again, cards for Magic the Gathering, and it's nowhere near as difficult as that, because Magic has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of cards, so a lot of them are just redundant, right? 1/1 for 1 red mana. Okay, done. That's a card. You know, it doesn't have to be amazing. 2 red mana, it's a 2/1 red creature with haste. Boom. You know, actually, that's really good. That might be too good for two. Well, it's red mana. That should be okay. Um, but like, yeah, boom. You know, there's a card. Done. Um, so so you want that when you come to designing a style, but like what I find is when I'm actually putting a style together, I don't really know how what its strategy is until after it's done, and I sometimes don't really know what its theme is until after it's done. I was surprised by Ravana's style and how biblical it became. I thought there was going to be a little bit of that in there, but it was straight up like, what if you were Old Testament God, but you had to fistfight everything? Like, that's Ravana. That's a really cool, like, that's an easy thing to sell to a player. And it might be harder to sell Yama. I think Yama's cool conceptually, but it's hard to make a bureaucrat sexy. You know what I mean? And a lot of his charms are like doing legal jurisdiction stuff. And it wound up being very, Bleach, actually, which I'm not even a big fan of Bleach. I'm somewhat aware of it. I've watched a few episodes. I kind of know overall what happens with it. I know some of the characters. But, like, the idea of there being this death bureaucracy, and there being a lot of, like, paperwork and formality to the whole thing, and there being a very, like, clean and understood hierarchy of how this all works, and it being not something that's not perfectly encompassing government, but, like, internally it's very strict and organized, and its authority is kind of broadly recognized outside of it. Like, that wound up being like the central thing that you get to be a part of when you take Yama techniques. It's surprising, and a weird sell, but it made it necessary for me to go back into the very scant lore that I wrote for Yama, and more cleanly articulate the not only the role of the people that worked within that bureaucracy and why those powers were important, but how Yama, being a master of them, wound up forming that around him. It's a little more clear that, like, Ravana becomes the city, right? Like, that's pretty clear from his stuff. But with Yama seems distinct from the place that he is. He isn't the physical, like, office of the bureaucracy, nor is he the physical wall of bone that surrounds hell. But what he is like, he's the bureaucracy itself, the organization and the rules and the way people deal with it. That wound up being Yama. It was a surprising place to find him, but there he was. And I'm curious how these other Ashura are going to come out. So that's something that's been fascinating in the writing. Another interesting thing about the writing is I've been working on the robot stuff for Babel Kiminar. It's in a very early state. I haven't written anything down on the computer yet, but I'm really interested to start. I want there to be an artificial hero archetype, right? Where you're like fully a robot, and then you just put robot parts on, and that's mostly how your style works. But I want to contrast that with learning martial arts, and I want the mystical martial arts to be something that makes you more human and gives you more of a soul, whereas the robot parts make you more powerful, easier, but they make you less human. And I think that's a fun contrast. I think number one, and it means that we're adding some more metaphysical rules and like weight to what it means to be a mystical martial artist in this world, which I like that a lot. I think that deepens the lore in a way that's actionable and meaningful to players and GMs. So I like that. But I also like the idea that you could not be a robot. You could just be like a dude, but you lost your arm, and so you get a robot arm. And I think that's really cool too. And in addition to the robot stuff and being able to learn styles of any variety, I want them to have I want their society to be broken into 3 different nations within this giant floating city. There's Nation A and Nation B, and then between them, growing out of the conflict between those 2 nations, there's this kind of like free area that has become a Nation C, which is a fusion of both their cultures and also their own culture. And right now, the things I'm looking at are like steampunk England, which I think would be really cool, like industrial style steampunk England. Soviet Russia, like not like real Soviet Russia, but like what if they had mecha, like that kind of like aesthetic. I really think that's cool. And the middle one, I wanted to be something kind of like a like neon Hong Kong thing. I want to avoid making any of those things like a let's gaze at these weird alien blah blah blah. I want them to feel like grown out of and inspired by those cultures, not like I don't want to fetishize them, I guess. So I'm doing a little bit of studying on all of those things before I write down those concretely. But I'd like each of those nations to have its own unique single style. And I also want the styles to cap out around master level techniques. I think that they should be about as rare and hard to find as supreme level techniques are down in the larger world of Ashes and Ghosts. And the reason I want to do that is because supreme techniques alter settings of that size. So if you have them, they would have been used by now, and they would have altered the setting. So I much prefer the idea that they're just not accessible there. So you can alter individual cities within this larger, like, nation state, but you can't really alter the nation state itself with a single move of power. So that's something I've been designing paradigmatically for that. So look forward to all of that stuff as I continue to develop it. And I think that 16 minutes is probably enough of your time. So thank you all for being patient in this next phase of things. You're going to have lots of goodies here in the not too distant future. Peace.